Coming up on the program, the wait for vaccines. The opposition in Ottawa continues to press the government for more details on the vaccine rollout. We'll hear from our panel of MPs and from our journalists on the government's handling of the issue. With reports that the U.S. and China are negotiating a deal to free Chinese executive Meng Wanzhou being held in Canada for extradition, could that mean freedom for Canadians Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig being held in China? We'll ask Justice Minister David Lametti, who also talks about the government's legislation on medical assistance in dying and the rights of Indigenous people. But we start with the much-awaited arrival of successful COVID-19 vaccines in Canada. On Friday, speaking with reporters, Prime Minister Trudeau said Ottawa's distribution plans are ready to go as soon as the vaccines get Health Canada approval.
The Canadian Armed Forces is already holding simulation tests of this distribution plan with a series of exercises and run-throughs. Freezers have been purchased and dry ice contracts for cold shipping are being put in place. When vaccines get authorized and shipped, we'll be ready.
Well, joining me now are three MPs from different parties. Adam Van Koeverden is a Parliamentary Secretary and the Liberal MP for the Ontario riding of Milton. Garnett Genuis is a Conservative MP for the Alberta riding of Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan. And Jenny Kwan is a NDP Deputy Health Critic and MP for Vancouver East. All three of you, thanks for joining us.
It's quite great to be with you today.
Okay, well, let's start with the opposition motion, which was debated all day yesterday. It's a motion from the Conservatives calling on the government to issue a report by Wednesday, December the 16th. In that report, there would be timelines for the arrival of vaccines in Canada, dates for their distribution, vaccination schedules, and criteria for the government to determine who gets the first limited number of doses. Adam Van Koeverden, can your government and will your government provide such a report?
Absolutely. We have a plan, and we've been working very, very closely with stakeholders across the country, including provinces and the armed forces. So not only do we have a plan, but we are ensuring that it's well-rehearsed and seamless. We're working closely as well with international bodies and with the producers of these vaccines. And yes, we're more than happy to provide all pertinent information, as we have been. I should say there have been briefing calls and technical calls on a weekly basis for everybody the media as well as opposition members. So we debated the bill yesterday, or the motion yesterday, and I do believe that we'll be providing more information as we have been.
Okay, one question which still remains to be answered. I'm going to get to your opposition colleagues, but one question, a simple one, which still remains to be answered, and that is what is the date for the first vaccines arriving in Canada? We still don't have that. Do we have that yet?
Well, we don't, because the Health Canada regulators have not approved the vaccine yet, and that is the first step. And as a politician, I will always rely on scientists and regulators and experts, not political motivations to have these things done. It's very important that we rely on experts, as we have been from the beginning of COVID-19, because we are blessed in Canada with great academics and experts across a variety of immunology and virology fields that are guiding all of our decisions.
Okay, Garnett Genuis, is it realistic to ask for the level of specificity that you're asking for? You're even asking for vaccination timetables in this motion. Is this overkill, or is the government actually able to provide all of this information that you request in this motion?
I think it's very important, especially during a time of pandemic, that the government be communicating clearly with Canadians, including the information that we put forward. In some ways, it's unfortunate that as an opposition, we have to use opposition day motions as a way to compel the government to disclose information which they should be disclosing anyways. There's been a lot of discussion about the need to build awareness and build confidence around public health measures. The way to do that is for the government to be transparent. And we have seen a lot of mixed messages when it comes to vaccination timelines. Back in August, Minister Baines was saying it would be sometime this fall, and then we've just been all over the map ever since then in terms of when exactly this is going to roll out. And I appreciate the point, and nobody's going to disagree with the point that there needs to be a robust approval process by independent experts first. I think what Canadians are asking is when they look at approval processes in other jurisdictions, and that's true around testing as well. You know, that we have rapid and at-home tests that have been approved in other jurisdictions that haven't been approved here. We need those independent approval processes, but Canadians are right to ask questions if they're seeing things approved in other jurisdictions with similar standards, and those things are not approved here. When timelines are being set in other jurisdictions about when people living in the U.S., the U.K. are going to be able to get access to vaccinations, and when those same timelines aren't being set here. So the processes have to be independent, but if Canadians are at the back of the line, if Canadians are behind people in other countries, that's where I think that raises red flags for people.
Jenny Kwan, will the NDP caucus vote for this motion? And if it passes, obviously in a minority parliament, if all opposition parties vote for it, it'll pass, and then you'll have an official call on the government to provide all this information. Will you vote for it, and do you think it's realistic to ask all of these things?
Well, the NDP supports the motion. I think it is very important for the Canadian government, for the Liberals, to be forthcoming and be transparent for Canadians. Canadians are so worried about what's going to happen. When will they get the vaccine? They're watching the numbers go up day by day, right? The impact's been very, very significant. And the only information we got so far has been conflicting information, different dates, different timelines that different government officials and ministers had provided. The other thing that Canadians are asking is this: why aren't we prepared to manufacture our own vaccine? In fact, Garnett Labs used to be a world-class, world-recognized, publicly owned entity that produced vaccines and prescription drugs for Canadians. And of course, it was the Mulroney government under the Conservatives that privatized it. Now, that was back in 1986. And so moving forward to today, we seem to not be able to move forward to bringing back a Canadian manufacturer, and we're behind relative to other countries. Other countries are able to produce their own vaccine: Germany, India, China, Brazil, US, UK, etc. But then Canada is left behind. And so we're behind the 8 ball all the time. So the NDP is also calling for the Liberals to actually bring back a Crown Corporation, a publicly owned entity, if you will, and manufacturer, so that we can ensure that we deal with these kinds of crises going forward.
Okay, Adam Van Koeverden, I want to ask you something else. We got news from Pfizer, the international pharmaceutical company Pfizer, that it will only be able to deliver about half of its previously announced amounts of vaccine before the end of the year. So that concerns this year. But it does raise questions about the supply that the Canadian government is counting on getting. We're supposed to be receiving up to 4 million doses from Pfizer by the end of March. Do you think this announcement, do you know if this announcement might affect expectations here in Canada of how much we'll receive from them between January and March?
That's a very good question, and it's troubling news out of Pfizer this morning. But because we have such a robust portfolio of vaccines, we have 7 now that we can exercise options with. We don't anticipate that the news that we heard today will have an impact on the number of vaccines that we will receive from Pfizer. But we are also exercising options with Moderna to receive an additional 20 million vaccines, bringing that number up to 40 million vaccines. So the reason that we have such a diverse portfolio is so that we can rely on multiple sources, because none of them are a guarantee. And before I stop there, I just wanted to say that I'm really, really glad that both of my colleagues today are talking about the importance of good information. Because as many of the members of the Conservative Party have been asking for more information, other members have been peddling misinformation. And I brought this up yesterday in the House of Commons because I think it's really important. We all have platforms as elected officials. People rely on us for really, really good, reliable information that helps Canadians. And I think we have a duty to do just that. We are a method of communications for our constituents. But lately, members of the Conservative Party have been sponsoring petitions questioning the effectiveness and the efficacy and the health of vaccines, calling it human experimentation. I've seen members from Alberta talking about questioning the legitimacy of numbers and deaths. And then just last week, I heard a radio interview with a Conservative member from Niagara comparing COVID-19 to the seasonal influenza.
Did you present a readout
of
this discussion already?
Okay,
and it's really troubling. It's really troubling that members of the Conservative Party are not willing to call their colleagues out, members of their own party, when they're misleading Canadians, and that's what we're seeing right now.
Okay, on that, I'll have to let Garnett Genuis weigh in on that. What do you make of? I mean, we did have one person tabling a petition which called the advanced speed vaccination, a human experiment, and all that. But what do you make of those accusations?
So I think it's important to underline that in May of this year, Ron McKinnon, the Liberal chair of the Health Committee sponsored petition 2424, and that was an e-petition that raised concerns about the negative impacts of cell towers on children. And at the time, the Liberal chair of the Health Committee
right now,
said,
Garnett,
let me
okay, hold on, one at a time. So your point is?
The Liberal chair of the Health Committee said at the time that he sponsored the petition, even though he didn't agree with it, because people in his riding had asked him to. Now, without commenting on Mr. McKinnon's petition or Mr. Sloan's petition, I do think that if a line like that, if the statement that they were responding to their constituents, even though they didn't necessarily agree with it, if that line was good enough for the Liberal chair of the Health Committee, and if Mr. Van Koeverden didn't call out Ron McKinnon at that time, then it's interesting now that he's wanting to call out people
recall there being
on the other side of the aisle.
I think there's a question.
Okay, on that,
there's a question about
as to whether
the appropriateness of signing petitions or sponsoring petitions, but there's clearly a double standard.
So the point is, it's about petitions.
Again, this isn't just an individual member of Parliament. This is the chair of the Health Committee.
That wasn't the question,
right?
Okay, I want to. I've been told that we're out of time, but I want to thank you both. The point about petitions is an interesting one. We are out of time, but I want to thank all three of you for taking part. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
There are media reports that the U.S. Justice Department is negotiating with China for the release of telecom executive Meng Wanzhou, being held in Canada for extradition to the U.S. After Canada detained Meng, authorities in China jailed two Canadians, Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig. They have been detained now for almost 2 years and charged with spying. The Chinese have linked any consideration of their fate to the release of Meng Wanzhou. On Friday, Prime Minister Trudeau was asked about the reports of a possible deal.
For almost 2 years, we've been working extremely hard to bring home these two Michaels. It is an absolute priority for the government. I won't be commenting on any of the recent reports. I think we're going to continue to work as hard as we possibly can to bring these two Michaels home. It's been extremely difficult for them, for their families and their loved ones. We will continue to stand up for Canadians in difficulty anywhere around the world.
Joining me now is Canada's Justice Minister David Lametti. Minister Lametti, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
Okay, we have to start, though, with the news that is being made today, and that is these reports out of the United States that the U.S. Justice Department is in negotiations for a type of deferred prosecution agreement that could see the release of Meng Wanzhou. Do you have any reaction for us on those reports?
I'm aware of the reports, but I obviously can't comment on them.
Okay. Have you been made aware of them through official channels?
Once again, it's not something that I can comment on.
Okay. But you were made aware of them around the same time that the reports were leaked to the Wall Street Journal?
I can't comment on any of the matter.
Okay. All right. Well, let's get to Bill C-7, which I know also is a big concern for you. This is the medical assistance in dying legislation, made some crucial changes. You're facing a court-imposed deadline of December 18th. The bill is still before the House of Commons. It's also still before the Senate. How confident are you that your new medical assistance in dying legislation will meet the deadline?
Well, I'm still optimistic. The Senate has done a pre-study, and I know that they have some concerns that they have raised. Once we get it to the Senate, we will undertake those discussions with them, and I'll make myself available to senators to make sure that their concerns are being heard. The main challenge right now is to get it out of the House of Commons, where, frankly, the Conservatives, a rump group of the Conservative Party, has basically co-opted their leader into allowing them to filibuster, notwithstanding a fair bit of support even in the Conservative Party, and certainly across the House of Commons and across Canada for this piece of legislation. So we hope that they'll do their duty and pass this legislation in third reading so that we can send it on to the Senate. Once it's there, I'm optimistic. Look, it's a tight deadline. I understand that. But I'm still optimistic that, again, this bill has the vast support of Canadians. We did do a great deal of consultation, including with disability communities who helped shape the legislation, quite frankly. And so we feel that we have met their concerns, and we're we're pushing to move forward with this.
So there is a forecast for the final vote in the House of Commons next week. Whether or not you have to use time allocation, that will come. But you mentioned the Senate. There are some very deep divisions showing up in the Senate. There are some profound concerns some of the senators are expressing. You know the Senate. You know they have a significantly wider margin in terms of length of debate. What are the chances that this will get pushed over until next year? This will not make the deadline in the Senate.
Well, we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. They have done a pre-study, which is helpful, so that we can get directly to their deliberations in the Senate chamber. Again, I'm willing to work with senators. I have heard their concerns to some extent. On the main question, I firmly and fully believe this bill is constitutional. That the carve-out exemption for mental illness being the sole criterion. It is temporary in the sense that we have always planned to study that in the further legislative review that is required by the 2016 law. But I do feel that it is constitutional. It's a very narrow carve-out, and we will get to those concerns, those very legitimate concerns. It's just that there is a deep division in the medical community about how to move forward, and failing that, it is difficult to see a way to move forward in a closer time.
You have had 2 extensions from the Quebec Superior Court to get this deadline, the current deadline of December 18th. Those who have these deep concerns about the bill, or those who want more time in the Senate, for example, say that you could simply go back to the Quebec Superior Court. They're saying that this deadline is largely self-imposed, largely arbitrary, and some of them also point out that the fact that the government actually prorogued Parliament for almost 50 days, that you could have gotten to this earlier. What are the chances of going to the court and asking for an extension?
Well, look, I'm not going to rule out any possibilities, but that being said, there's no guarantee of getting an extension. The court already gave us a second extension, and it really is up to them. They found the original law unconstitutional, or aspects of it unconstitutional, and that decision will stand if we don't get this law passed. So again, there are no guarantees on any of this. Even if I were to ask for another extension, there's no guarantee that the court would accord it.
Okay, and that would mean what? The entire law would be null and void, or just certain measures in it?
Certain measures in it would be have been found to be unconstitutional, so they would be inoperative in Quebec, but not in the rest of Canada. So that does 2 things. It creates a great deal of legal uncertainty in Quebec. So practitioners who want to be guided by the law in order to know what they are doing is legal or illegal, that degree of uncertainty may have quite a chilling effect on practitioners in Quebec. So I would say to my fellow Quebec MPs and to Quebec senators, there is a great deal of negative impact for Quebec as well as for the rest of Canada. Then obviously in the rest of Canada, the law continues to stand, but then we have an unequal situation as between Quebec and the rest of Canada, and that in and of itself is the basis for a constitutional challenge. So it creates a very unhealthy situation both in Quebec and across the rest of Canada, and I would ask that MPs and senators take their responsibilities very seriously.
Okay, I want to get to, there's not much time left, but I want to get to another bill which you tabled this week, a monumental bill, Bill C-15, to harmonize Canada's laws with the United Nations Universal Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. There was widespread, this was welcomed by the Indigenous community in Canada, but some of the people, including the National Chief of the Assembly First Nations, Perry Bellegarde, take issue with the fact that you're giving yourself 3 years to have a full action plan for harmonizing measures and taking action on systemic discrimination in Canada's laws. Could the time frame be shorter?
Well, we'll certainly look at that. We've worked closely with National Chief Bellegarde. We've worked closely with President Obed and National Spokesperson Chartrand, as well as other levels of Indigenous government across Canada. It's complex. There are a number of each nation is a nation with its own leadership, and so it is complex in terms of cooperation and co-development of an action plan. So the 3 years is meant to account for that. It's a challenging task, but it's one, frankly, that I or any one of my colleagues, I think, would gladly take on. That being said, we've worked with National Chief Bellegarde, and we have a parliamentary process. If we think if we can be convinced that it can be done in less than 3 years, we'll obviously look at that. This is not going to be a point on which we will depart.
Okay, Minister Lametti, I want to thank you very much for taking the time.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Well, joining me now are two journalists with the Parliamentary Press Gallery. Mia Rabson is a national political reporter with the Canadian Press, and Tonda MacCharles is a parliamentary reporter for the Toronto Star. Both of you, thanks for joining us.
Hi.
Well, listen, both of you have been reporting on this since the very first day of the pandemic, because I know you've been on this. And my question to you is, we are now at a point where vaccines have taken up so much of the attention, and politically as well. There's a lot we know. There's a lot of unanswered questions. My question to the two of you who've been following this is, for what is unanswered, is it reasonable that it's unanswered, or is there reason for the politicians to be pressing and upset? Mia.
I'd say some of it is probably reasonable. I think it's understandable that we don't have exactly the dates on when everything's going to be delivered, because there is a lot of uncertainty both from the companies and on the approval side. So my understanding is that the government, or that Pfizer or Moderna, or whichever company we're talking about, isn't going to say we're delivering them on this date until Health Canada says we have approved it and you're sort of good to go. These vaccines are so delicate, the Pfizer one in particular, and has to be stored at such low temperatures. One of the guidelines, for example, is it's in a special box. It can't be opened more than twice a day for 1 minute at a time, or the vials inside might actually be considered to be damaged and not usable. So they're being so careful about that, because the preciseness of how all of this has to be run down is very, very tricky. That said, there is some more information that the government probably could be giving us. We know, for example, now that there are 6 million doses in the first quarter. The government didn't tell us that. The Ontario government ended up telling us that. The federal government didn't. So there is some information that they probably could be giving us, and more answers, or even saying a little bit more specific, even if it can't be a specific date. Mm-hmm. So some of it's reasonable, some of it's not.
Tonda, I mean, for one of the examples, though, I mean, one of the sticking points politically, Tonda, this week has been people saying, okay, we know that you can't tell us exactly when the first vials of vaccine will arrive, but give us a play date after that. There's got to be, give us the day 1, day 2, day 3. Give us your game plan. Is that a fair criticism?
Right, and I think that, Conservative leader Erin O'Toole did that in the House of Commons, right? He said, well, most military planners will say, okay, if you don't know the exact date, take it from a theoretical date and then go out day 1, day 2, date plus 1 day, date plus 2 days. What does it look like? I think those details we don't have, and it makes everybody wonder, does the government even have them? In other words, does the government have that kind of specificity, or if I could call it that, specific date of delivery in the contract itself? Or are we depending quite a bit on the goodwill of the company to deliver sort of grosso modo, more or less the big package? And we're already hearing that they're going to be, it's all like Mia described, right? It's going to be a staggered delivery out over the next 3 months. So there are things we don't know that we could know that we should know. Is there a reason we don't know it? I mean, look, reporters and opposition politicians have been demanding answers. They're very cagey. I'm not sure how much of that is tied to their intent to not make it seem like a foregone conclusion. In other words, that the regulators will independently make a decision irrespective of political pressure, right? So I think that there's a bit of that at play.
What about the idea, too, which people are trying to get their heads around, and that is that when the first shipments arrive, they will be nowhere near fulfilling the need. And we today got this recommendations from the National Committee on Immunization about the target groups, which didn't surprise anyone, the elderly in care homes, in care settings, and elder people, 70 years or older with a preference 80, healthcare workers, and adult Indigenous people. We got those guidelines, but there's a lot of even harder decisions still to be made at the provincial level when it becomes obvious that we don't have enough even maybe for those groups.
Well, Theresa Tam, the Chief Public Health Officer, was asked today if this 6 million doses is going to be enough just to cover even that group of people. And she said that it should be, that those guidelines were kind of set up knowing we were going to get this many doses with some modeling about uptake. So it should cover that group. I mean, whether or not we had more doses coming to us in the first 6 months or first 3 months, whenever the period is. When you're rolling out a vaccine program, you can never vaccinate everybody at once. Even 10 years ago during H1N1, they had to have priority groups for vaccination because there's only so much that can be produced and shipped and even used at a time. So that sort of is normal. The question is, how will the provinces actually use those guidelines? Some of them did back in 2009. Some of them did not. Okay. So are the provinces going to use those guidelines? And now that they have them, when are we going to see from each province how they're going to use them? I mean, people want to know, when am I going to get vaccinated? When is my mother, who's in a long-term care home, going to get vaccinated, that I might actually be able to go see her? Mm-hmm. So those are questions that they're desperate. I mean, the anxiety around this is so huge. So every little tidbit of information is so important right now.
Both of you are at the briefings. Like Tonda, you were at the briefing yesterday by the now weekly briefings on the vaccine, state of vaccines in Canada. And there's Major General Jenny Kwan giving details. Are they going a long way or not to answering some of the vital questions? Is it helping?
They are. No, look, it's the first. Well, first of all, it was only the second technical briefing. Yeah. Since they've been working on it apparently since April. So It would have been nice to have had something along these lines much earlier. And we might have actually stemmed some of the questions. But no, it's useful because Jenny Kwan gave us quite a bit of information yesterday from the number of sites that are going to be the first receivers of a Pfizer vaccine, and then how many sites they're going to ramp up to in order to accommodate the Moderna and whatever other vaccines eventually get approved. There was quite a bit of detail in terms of the planning that they're doing and what they're trying to foresee. Look, these are details that the government, according to the government, since they started negotiating and started to sign contracts since August, could have rolled out a lot of this detail a lot earlier. Instead, I think the political pressure is built on them. They're seen now to be reacting to it. Mm-hmm. But more importantly, I think some of the public anxiety around it might have been curbed a bit. So, that's on them.
Okay, a question. We only have about a minute and a half left. Mia, I have to ask you this because I know so many years of reporting for the Winnipeg Free Press. Manitoba Premier Brian Pallister made some comments yesterday, and I'm still trying to make heads or tails of them, where he says he's concerned by the fact that a certain proportion of vaccines to Manitoba will be cleaved off to give to Indigenous communities, and he's concerned that that could be taken away from the overall per capita allocation to Manitoba. Those comments are setting off sparks. What do we make of them? And are there going to be other comments from premiers questioning the allocation of vaccines like that?
Well, I think Premier Pallister will have to explain what he meant by that. I think there are some who are wondering if he's suggesting that people who are living in the Indigenous communities shouldn't be getting this vaccine earlier. I mean, they were among the priority groups. He seemed to maybe be worried that Manitoba was going to get less overall. But it doesn't necessarily make sense on that front, just because these are people who live in Manitoba and are still Manitobans. So he will have to explain specifically what he meant by that. I do think that, again, it comes down to the provinces want to know how much they're getting. They're the ones who actually have to get it into people's arms. Yeah. This is the one thing people don't always remember. Ottawa's approving the vaccine. Ottawa's buying the vaccine. The provinces are the ones who have to actually then distribute it to people and get it into arms. That is a very complex process to do. And if they don't know how many people or how many doses they're going to get, they can't really plan for that. And so this is a little bit of that anxiety as well.
Okay, last thought to you on this topic, Tonda.
Well, look, again, I think that there's a need for transparency on the federal government side for them to tell us what their view of that is. How much should go out on a per capita basis? How much should go out on the basis of, say, how bad the outbreak is in a certain province or region of the country? Newfoundland's got a pretty good disease picture right now. They don't have a lot. I think they have 1 or 2 cases or something. Yeah. So does it make sense to heave a whole bunch of vaccination down to a place where they really don't have a huge outbreak right now? Or does it make sense to ship it to where it's really needed most, in a province or a region or a community where they're smothering under COVID?
All of these questions you can ask at next week's briefing on vaccines. Okay, both of you, I want to thank you very much for taking the time. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks. Have a good weekend, guys.
Well, that's all the time we have for this edition of Primetime Politics. I'm Martin Stringer. On behalf of all of us here at CPAC, thanks for watching and have a great weekend.